I'm Hindol Gupta. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome onto this interview platform a wonderful guest. This is his book. And the reason we're doing this interview is because I read this book. I really enjoyed it. It's called The Kathmandu Dilemma Resetting India Nepal Ties. Ambassador Ranjit Rai is my guest today on the interview. Very quickly, Ambassador Ranjit Rai, of course, as the book suggests, is an expert on all things India and Nepal, but he's also a former Indian ambassador to Nepal. He headed the Northern Division in the Ministry of External Affairs, dealing with India's Himalayan neighbors, Nepal and Bhutan, from 2002 to 2006. And since his retirement, he has been involved in many track 2 negotiations and conversations in the region of his expertise. I want to welcome Ambassador Rai to the interview. Thank you for joining us, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I want to begin by asking you, there are increasing concerns, and I want to begin with this question because that's one of the key focus. There are increasing concerns, Ambassador, that Chinese Communist Party influence in Nepal is growing very steadily, including recently, in 2021, the Nepal Communist Party even organized sessions to help understand Xi Jinping thought in Nepal. Of course, we know about the immense infrastructure building, including railway lines that are happening with Chinese money in Nepal. Could you begin by talking to us a little bit about what's really going on and how concerned should India be?
Well, certainly there's a lot going on, and the Chinese are indeed extremely active, not only in the Belt and Road Initiative projects that you mentioned, because the BRI is a global phenomenon. The Chinese are investing in many, many countries. Nepal happens to be one of them. But more than that, I think the Chinese, have a two-pronged strategy. You have the government-to-government interaction. And since Nepal also has pretty strong communist parties, there's a very robust interaction between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nepalese Communist parties. In fact, before President Xi's visit in 2019 November, there was a strong delegation from the Chinese Communist Party, and all sorts of agreements were signed. And this is one of the things that was discussed was training of Communist Party cadres in Nepal, training them on how to manage the relationship between the party and the government, training them on things like Xi Jinping thought. So certainly Chinese involvement has grown. And unlike in the past, when it was focused on sort of developmental issues, I think today it's pretty much focused also on internal political issues in Nepal. And as you referred to, the Chinese have been very deeply involved in bringing the disparate communist forces together. They haven't succeeded, but I think this is a long-term effort. And this is something that we will see more of in the coming days. So certainly this is a new dimension to Chinese involvement. And I think India needs to monitor this very carefully.
So the whole, our Himalayas, so to speak, including Nepal, are getting more and more complex because of the infrastructure India is building on its side. Because as India guards its peripheries more and more strongly, Chinese activity is growing very steadily. Talk to us a little bit about the government in Nepal. There have been all kinds of conversation about Indian support to the erstwhile monarchy. Could Nepal go back to becoming a kingdom again? Where do we stand? In your opinion, where do we stand in all of these conversations? What is India's real aim in Nepal at the moment? Of course, apart from all the help and cooperation that we all constantly provide Nepal, what are other strategic positions that India is taking today in Nepal?
Well, first, Nepal is going through a huge political churn. They had this Maoist insurgency for a 10-year period. They had the Madhesi agitations in the Tarai, in the plains of Nepal. And, there were certain demands that arose out of these revolutions and agitations, and these were incorporated in the new constitution. And so Nepal became a federal, republican, secular country. Now, the last elections, I think, to me, it appears that there is a certain pushback against some of these major developments that happened post 2006 and post 2008. And there seems to be a certain disenchantment with not only the political processes in Nepal. There are frequent changes of governments, non-delivery on development programs. A third of the Nepalese people, travel abroad to find work. So there's a certain disenchantment. And there's also a certain disenchantment with the nature of the federal system. A lot of people feel it's too expensive, it doesn't deliver. There is also a certain pushback against, secularism. There are demands for restoration of the Hindu Rashtra. There are some voices, not very significant as yet, for a restoration of the monarchy. So clearly there is a churn, a political churn going on in Nepal, and nobody can really predict which way it goes. I think as far as India is concerned, I think we have to anchor our relationship in the economic dimension. This is not to say that the cultural, the religious, and the people to people contact is not important. I mean, that is absolutely critical and fundamental to the relationship. But going forward, I think our vision should be and is to have a regionally integrated economic space where all our neighbors, and I'm referring in particular to Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal, can partake of the great economic dynamism of the Indian economy, benefit from it, integrate with the Indian economy. And we're already doing this in terms of the hydropower cooperation, not just bilaterally, but also with Bangladesh. And I think this is the way to go. When our neighbors have developed a vested interest in the economic growth of India and they actually benefit tangibly, I think that is really the best way to go forward and to really cement the relationship.
Mentioned the return of a certain disenchantment with the federal process, perhaps a bit of disenchantment with democratic processes itself. As you correctly pointed out, Nepal goes through very frequent changes in government. A lot of the baseline, numbers of its developmental indices don't change. There is also, a lot of rampant poverty. There's also a lot of corruption. So this disenchantment, obviously, one can understand where it comes from. Do you think there could be, or is there also voices wanting to go back to a sort of communist era? Or is that idea completely dead in Nepal? Could it be, or are there people trying to revive it? Because there are voices suggesting that links between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nepalese Communist Party are ever rising, and there could, in fact, be a sort of resurgence of that mood in Nepal. Do you think that is an accurate assessment?
So I really don't think so. I don't think, Nepal has never really been communist. And the communist parties developed in Nepal for certain very specific reasons, especially, during the 60s and thereafter. And the relationship with China for Nepal is really not necessarily in terms of, communist China so much, but in the sense that China is a balance to India. India looms very large in the Nepalese imagination and psyche. And so they want to have some counterbalancing power, which is China in this particular case. In the old days, it used to be the US to a certain extent. But certainly the communist parties in Nepal are pretty strong. And they are strong not because of the ideology so much, but because of the nationalism. Nepalese nationalism, to a certain extent, is based on this anti-India sentiment in Nepal. This asymmetry in size creates this kind of sentiment, which certainly some of the leftist-oriented parties tend to exploit. So I don't see any, communist system emerging in Nepal. In fact, the communist parties are really not communist in the traditional sense of the term, but certainly, they anchor their policies in terms of Nepal's relationship with India to a certain extent.
want to ask you, you mentioned deeper economic cooperation. In recent history, we have, of course, moved away from the time when there would be blockades on the Indian-Nepalese border, and the Nepalese would blame the Indians for it, and there would be, a lot of political sort of hand-wringing and, issues about these things. We have moved away from that era, of course. Tell us what has changed in the last 8 years.
Well, a lot has changed in Nepal. I mean, there is a new constitution. Of course, not everybody was extremely happy with it, and which is why, as I said, there's a certain pushback. I think there is a realization in Nepal, and especially you see it amongst the younger people, that Nepal need not be in the position it finds itself today. There is no reason for Nepal to be a least developed country. And there is every aspiration that the youth of Nepal have, like the youth of India. And so you have new political forces emerging of educated, young people who have experience of living and working abroad and who now want to participate in the political system in Nepal and change things for the better. So I think this is a new dynamic at play. And it's not just the traditional political forces, but the new political forces that India really needs to reach out to and engage with, and especially the youth.
You mentioned economic cooperation. Now, we also know that Nepal, in its recent past, has its first billionaire, who's actually a Madeshi, and and the business of that group not only is in Nepal but across India's northeast and in other parts of South Asia. Do you think there is entrepreneurial energy that could, push this relationship forward? And also, the second part of the question is, in the competition to put in money into Nepal to develop its infrastructure, develop its economy, can India hope to compete with China?
We really have to have smart projects. And I think we're pretty good at that. We have improved our program delivery in Nepal considerably. An oil pipeline was built in record time. The integrated checkposts, two of them have opened. Work is going to start on the others. The railway connectivity projects have moved ahead. So certainly, I think India is upping the stake in Nepal, and you can also see that in terms of our cooperation in the hydropower sector. And this is really going to be a game changer. We have a 900 megawatt project, which is under construction, doing extremely well. And I hope very much that the G2G, government to government, this is a 5,000 megawatt project on the Mahakali River, the Pancheshwar project, also progresses. On the other, on entrepreneurship, absolutely. The Nepalese people are very entrepreneurial, and they have to, the government has to create the right environment. Uh, like we have unicorns in India, there is no reason why unicorns can't emerge in Nepal. Secondly, I think skill development is a major area that Nepal needs to focus on, where India can help. Because it's not only that Nepal needs skilled people, skilled workforce, but since a lot of Nepalese travel abroad, skilled Nepalese working abroad will naturally earn much more than unskilled labor. And so I think this is another area that India really needs to engage with Nepal in.
Conclusion then, Ambassador, what is the greatest threat in Nepal that India should be aware of? And what is the greatest opportunity at this point in time, in your opinion?
For me, the greatest threat is prolonged instability in Nepal. Instability in Nepal makes Nepal vulnerable to a lot of external influences, and some of these influences may not be in India's best interest or indeed in Nepal's own interest. So I really feel that Nepal needs to have durable long-term political stability, and the only way that this can really be achieved is through economic prosperity and economic development. In terms of the biggest opportunity, I think there are a lot of opportunities, but I think the silver lining that I see really is our cooperation in hydropower, and I'm looking at it in a very immediate context. I mean, there are huge opportunities in the future. But right now, I think we are focusing on this. And I think this will really create a win-win situation, not only for India and Nepal, but Bhutan and Bangladesh as well.
Hydropower, considering what has happened in India's own Uttarakhand, and questions about sustainability and other issues, how are we managing to, contain those issues, or do those issues not, come into play in Nepal?
No, these are very important issues. I mean, there are a lot of geological surprises in the Himalayas. Water flows are affected by climate change. So clearly, these are issues that have to be dealt with. There are rehabilitation issues. People have to be resettled, and we've done that extremely well in the Tehri Dam project. But I personally feel that, since water is really Nepal's major resource, they have to develop it, and technological and other solutions have to be found to some of the problems that we encounter. Just because there are these problems doesn't mean that we stop moving forward on the development of hydropower. So I personally feel, yes, there are problems. Those problems have to be handled, but we have to go forward.
Well, do you think the where does the Nepalese monarchy stand in all of this today?
The Nepalese monarchy at one time used to be very popular. The previous king, the king who was assassinated,
Yes.
was really revered and loved by his people. Thereafter, I think the monarchy made a series of missteps
Mm.
in the handling of the situation in Nepal, and felt that they could go back to a period of executive monarchy, by taking all power into their hands. And this was the decision they had taken at a time when the Maoist insurgency was at its peak. And perhaps the monarch felt he could marginalize the democratic political parties and also deal with the Maoists. And this obviously didn't work. Because, if you look at Nepal historically, even multi-party democracy has come through huge agitations and movements of the people. It hasn't been easy. So trying to reverse these processes was obviously a very, very difficult task, and it didn't succeed. And in the process, Nepal lost its 200-year-old monarchy.
All of that, of course, many of these things you can read in this brilliant book written by Ambassador Ranjit Rai, Kathmandu Dilemma, Resetting India-Nepal Ties. Highly recommend this book. Thank you, Ambassador, for sparing time to talk to us. We would love to talk to you, in weeks and months to come as the situation in Nepal develops. But thank you for speaking to me on Global Order. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much.